All right, welcome to Introduction to Ecology, Lesson 7. Last class we talked about how organisms deal with the physical environment. And then we focused in a little bit and specifically asked how organisms deal with temperature. But as we learned 2 classes ago, temperature isn't the only element or the only factor that makes up the physical environment. In fact, there's a number of other factors in the physical environment, and one of the big ones is precipitation or moisture. And so today we're going to talk about how organisms deal with moisture or the lack thereof. Before we do that, I want to go through a few basic definitions. The first is solvent. Solvent is any liquid that has the ability to dissolve other substances. And then there's solute, and a solute is compounds that are dissolved, and often these are salts. So what you probably learned in chemistry is that if I take solutes, which are compounds with one component that's positively charged and one that's negatively charged, frequently those are elements, sometimes they're a little bit more complex, and I put them into a liquid, those two components of the salt will actually dissociate and get surrounded by molecules of the liquid, and that's what we call dissolving. Now, water tends to be a very good solvent because it actually dissolves more substances than any other liquid, and that's why we call it the universal solvent. Why is that important for ecology? Well, it turns out that because water is such a great solvent, most of the time, organisms aren't just dealing with pure water, they're actually dealing with water that has a lot of stuff dissolved in it. And that affects the behavior of water, it affects the availability of water, and so anytime we think about moisture or water availability and how that impacts organisms, we also have to think about what's going on with the salt. The big reason is because salt and water are strongly interconnected. Salt balance and water balance really depend on each other, and that's because the movement of salt and the movement of water influence one another. Once again, I'm going to introduce a few more definitions. These are probably familiar to you. The first is hypoosmotic. So when the aquatic environment is hypoosmotic relative to the cell or to an organism, it means that the aquatic environment is less saline, has less salt in it than the organism. And so in this case, because there's excess water in the environment, there's going to be a net flow of water into the organism's cell. And I want to be really, really careful at this point. When I say hypoosmotic in reference to the environment, it's sort of about the environment. So if I say the environment is hypoosmotic relative to the cell, that means the environment has less salt than the cell. I could also say, for the same scenario, that the cell is hyperosmotic relative to the environment. And so that's our next definition. A hyperosmotic environment is an aquatic environment that is more saline than the organism. But a hyperosmotic organism has more saline than the environment. So again, it's all about your frame of reference. If I say hypoosmotic and I refer to the environment, that means the environment has less salt than the organism. If I say hypoosmotic and I refer to the organism, that means the organism has less salt than the environment. Hopefully that's clear. So again, a hyperosmotic environment is an aquatic environment that has more salt or is more saline than the organism. And in this case, there's a net flow of water out of the organism's cells, and that's because there's more water in the cell than there is in the environment, and so water flows out. Isoosmotic is the one you can't get confused. That's the one where everything's the same. So the aquatic environment is similar in salinity to the organism. And as a result, there's no net flow of water. There is flow of water. There's water flowing into the cell, but there's also water flowing out of the cell, and the two balance. So that it's like your bank account. If you're making the same amount of money as you're spending, nothing's really changing. All right, so again, if I talk about the environment and I say hypoosmotic, that means the environment has less salt than the cell. If I say the environment is hyperosmotic, that means the environment has more salt than the cell. And if I say the environment is isoosmotic, it means it has the same amount of salt as the cell. If I flip it all around, I can say that the cell is hypoosmotic relative to the environment, and that means the cell has less salt than the environment. If I say the cell is hyperosmotic relative to the environment, that means the cell has more salt than the environment. And if I say the cell is isoosmotic to the environment, that means the cell has the same salinity as the environment. So it's all about your frame of reference, what you're calling hypo versus hyperosmotic. I know that's a bit confusing, but I want to really stress that point that it's about the frame of reference, because that'll come up a little bit later in our discussion. All right. So now that we have a few basic definitions, let's think about why water matters to biology. Water matters because water is the majority of most organisms. Water content of most organisms is about 60 to 90%. And despite that, though, even though most organisms are mostly water, maintaining water balance can be challenging. And this is actually not a picture of my peace lilies, but it's what my peace lilies look like right now, and that's because I forget to water them and they are not doing very well at water balance. So with terrestrial organisms, water balance can be challenging because they tend to lose water to a dry atmosphere. There's just no water in the air, or there's not as much water in the air, and so they're just constantly losing water out to the atmosphere. With freshwater organisms, you might think, oh, everything's good, there's tons of water. With these guys, that's true, there is tons of water. That's actually part of the problem. Freshwater organisms struggle because they tend to lose solutes and gain water. So they're getting actually too much water from the environment at the expense of losing solutes. With marine organisms, they're actually the best. They tend to be isoosmotic to their environment, and so it's much less challenging to maintain water balance. They're not losing salts and gaining water, but they're also not losing water. So they have it best, although even with some marine organisms, it can be a struggle, as we'll see later on. All right, so what's driving all of this water movement? Why are we always losing water? Well, the nuts and bolts is that water flows along energy gradients. Water flows from a place where it has high energy to a place where it has low energy. And if that means it's leaving an organism, then that's what happens, and that's why the organism struggles to maintain a water balance. So there's a couple of different scenarios where water might move from a high energy to a low energy condition. The first is depending on salt concentrations. So when solutes are dissolved in water, the solution loses energy. And what that means is that water tends to flow from an area with less solutes to an area with more solutes, because as it flows to that area with more solutes, it loses energy. And this leads to what's known as the osmotic potential, which is the energy gradient that exists between a solution with low solute concentration, which is the high energy state, and a solution with high solute concentration, which is the low energy state. And so in this case, again, we're going to flow from the low solute concentration to the high solute concentration, because in doing so, the water can actually go from a high energy state to a low energy state. Another way that we can go from a high energy state to a low energy state is with gravity. So when water is raised above the earth, it gains energy, just like anything that you raise above the earth. And this energy is gravitational potential, which is the energy gradient that exists between water that is elevated, or high energy and far above the Earth's surface, and water that is closer to the ground and low energy. And so this is what drives sort of a lot of rivers flowing down the mountain, because they're higher energy at the top of the mountain. The water is higher energy up there than it is at the bottom, and that sort of causes this net movement of water across the mountain. For example, in the Smokies, where we have a lot of rivers at the top that flow down, join each other and become sort of streams and flow out to the sea eventually. All right, another scenario where water is flowing from high energy to low energy is when it's compressed. So when water is under pressure, just like anything, if you put energy and depress it, then it gains energy. And so this leads to what we call pressure or turgor potential, which is the energy gradient that exists between water that is more compressed and water that is less compressed. And so this is the principle that drives water out of a squirt gun, because it's compressed in at the bottom of the squirt gun, and then it shoots out the top where there's less compression. It matters in plants because that's actually what helps to sort of push plants out and up and hold their form. All right, finally, another example of where where water flows from a high energy state to a low energy state is in soils. And so when water molecules adsorb to the surface of objects, for example, soil particles, they lose energy. What does that mean? Well, that means that water that is not absorbed is higher energy, and water that is absorbed is lower energy. And this ultimately results in what we call matrix potential, which is the energy gradient that exists between water that's adsorbed to soil in its low energy state and water that's not absorbed to soil in its high energy state. Now, when I have a really waterlogged soil, all of the surface of that soil has water adsorbed to it, but then there's a lot of water that's, above the surface in between all the cracks that has nothing to adsorb to because of this, all the surfaces are used up. And if I contrast that to a dry soil where none of the surface is used up, then water can flow from that saturated soil where it doesn't have anything to adsorb to because the surfaces are all used, to that drier soil where it can find something to adsorb to. And that's what drives the flow of water from wet soils to dry soils. It's all that water that doesn't have any surface to stick to, and so it moves to a place where there are free surfaces, and that's why you get water flowing from sort of soggy soils into drier soils. So water potential is the sum of all those different potentials: osmotic, gravitational, pressure, and matrix potential. Now, when we're thinking about an individual organism, usually gravitational potential isn't a big one. The top of my head does not have that much more potential energy than the bottom of my feet. Usually organisms are not big enough for this to matter. And so generally when we're thinking about within an individual organism, we tend to focus on osmotic potential, pressure potential, and matrix potential, and ignore gravitational potential. For some very big organisms, that may not be the case. But in general, water moves from high potential to low potential. And so it doesn't just move along high osmotic to low osmotic or high pressure to low pressure. It actually moves along the sum of all of those from sort of a high overall potential to a low overall potential. And so you can get water moving against the osmotic potential if your other potentials sort of go in the opposite direction. All right. Now, unfortunately, all this water movement means that we're always faced with this challenge of retaining water. We want to keep ourselves 60 to 90% water, depending on what organism we are. And at the same time, we keep losing water because everything around us is sort of stealing it away because of this flow along these energy gradients. And so a lot of times what organisms develop is what's known as resistance, which is any force that impedes the movement of water along its energy gradient. So water wants to go one way, but we can stop that. We can stop that with different things. With animals, it tends to be with our skin. So amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals tend to have skin that resists the loss of water. Plants have waxy cuticles. Insects also have waxy cuticles, and these are layers that sort of prevent the water from moving in the direction it would like to move. All right. Ultimately, the water balance in organisms is determined by the water balance in the world around them, and particularly in the soil. And just as we've talked about energy balances and heat balances in other lessons, water balance really comes down to the gains and the losses. How are you gaining water and how are you losing the water? And so if I think about water balance in the soil, there's a couple of ways I can gain it. One is with precipitation. Anytime it rains, you add water to the soil. There's also what's known as overland flow, and this is where you have sort of runoff streaming down over the surface of the water and eventually settling in another place. And so that place where it settles, that will be a gain of water in that soil. Losses, there's a number of them. The first is transpiration or evaporation or evapotranspiration. So you can have just water evaporating from the soil, the surface of the soil, without any organisms involved, without any sort of plants doing it in between, just sort of coming right off the ground. You can also have transpiration from plants, and that's another way that water goes out into the environment. You also have runoff. So with runoff, you have the overland flow that may eventually sink in, but then you also have surface runoff that doesn't sink into the soil anywhere. It just ends up down in the river or on from the river to the ocean. And so that's no longer available in the soil. You also have percolation. So as water comes into the soil, the surface of the soil will sit there for a while, but eventually it kind of trickles down all the way down to through the soils until it's no longer available to plants. And then that's sort of it for the water. All right. So one of the big losses is that percolation and that movement of water down past where it's accessible by the plants and living organisms that are in the soil. And so when we think about what water is available and how organisms balance the water that's available, we have to think about how soil holds water. And so this comes down to soil water retention. And it's sort of determined by two things. It's determined by the pore space in the soil, and it's determined by the matrix potential. And different soils have different pore space and different matrix potential. And a lot of that's determined by the size of the particles in the soil. So if I think about a soil that's very gravelly with big particles, each of my particles is gonna have a low surface to volume ratio. And then if I go the opposite end to something like a clay soil, I have really, really small particles, and so I have a much larger surface to volume ratio. So not surprisingly, in sandy or gravelly soils that have big particles, they do not store water quite as well as fine texture soils like clay. And that's for a number of reasons. Well, first, you have larger pores in the sandy soil, and so water in those pores, they can't absorb to the surface of the particles. They're kind of stuck in the middle with nothing to absorb to, and so they kind of go really fast. They don't stick as well. Fine soil also has a higher matrix potential, which, again, that's because of that surface area. Because that fine surface, you have a much higher surface to volume ratio in the fine soil, there's more area for water to absorb to, and there's just basically more surface to stick, and so it holds the water better. And so between having smaller pores and more surface to absorb to, those fine soils really hold water a lot better, and those sandy soils with the big gravelly chunks, they have big pores, but they also have less matrix potential because they don't have the surface area, and so they lose water faster. So you might think, well, that means, clay soils with the little particles would be the best for supplying water to plants, and sandy soils would be the worst. That's not quite the whole story. So it turns out that soils with mixed coarse and fine particles are actually most effective at storing and supplying water to plants. And one of the problems is that how much water is stored is not necessarily the same as how much water is available to plants. So in sandy soils, they don't store water very well, and as a result, not much water is available to plants. So that's all fine. In your sort of fine particle soils, like your clays, they do store water really well. They hold on really tight. In fact, they hold on so tight that it's hard for plants to get it, right? And so what you'll see in this figure on the left, in sandy soils, I don't have much water at all. It doesn't matter whether it's available water or unavailable water, there's just not a lot of water in there. And again, those sandy soils are the ones with the big particles. In clay soils, I actually have a lot of water, but a whole lot of that water is not available. The plant can't get it because it's stuck so tightly to the surface of the clay, and there's not much in between the clay particles. There's not a lot of pore space in there holding any water that the plants can suck off. And so it's actually in that intermediate size where I have sort of enough water being held on, but it's not being held on so tight that the plants can't get it. And so again, it's that intermediate size, and particularly soils with mixed coarse and fine particles, that are most effective at storing and supplying water. All right. So that's a little bit about water in the environment. Now let's think about how organisms, and ultimately that's the source of water for organisms living in their environment. Now let's think about how organisms balance that water within their own bodies. So they're getting it from the source, which is the environment, but then they got to balance it within their bodies. And we'll look at a pile of different types of organisms, starting with microorganisms. So most, or a lot of microorganisms live in aqueous environments. And that means water is kind of there. They're not sort of drying out too much. And the balance of water in microorganisms is then determined by the osmotic potential. It's determined by sort of how hypotonic or how hypertonic the environment is relative to the bacterial cell. Or whatever other microorganism, the fungal cell, that sort of thing. And so, fortunately, in a lot of aquatic systems, osmotic potential is relatively stable. In the middle of the ocean, out sort of way out deep, the osmotic potential tends to be stable. It's not changing a lot from day to day, year to year. There are places, however, where even in aquatic environments, the osmotic potential changes. One good example is estuaries, tide pools. In these environments, you have the tide coming in and sort of bringing in new fresh water, and then they'll sit there and some of the water will evaporate, and that changes the salt conditions, and then the tide will go out and then the tide will come back in, and it'll fluctuate on a daily basis. Same thing in saline lakes. Depending on the rainwater that's coming in and the evaporation that's coming out, you may have variation in your salinity, and so variation in your osmotic potential. And then the cell needs to deal with that change in saltiness of the water around it, because the cell doesn't necessarily want to change in terms of how much salt is in it. Soils are another place where we can have changes in the osmotic potential. And that figure on the left actually shows the salinity of soil as a function of rainfall. And what you'll notice is that when we have periods of high rainfall, the salinity drops because we're adding all this fresh water to the system. But then in the periods where we don't have rainfall, the salinity starts to build again because the water is evaporating off or it's percolating down through the soils and leaving the salt in place. And so that soil becomes saltier and saltier in that inter period where you don't have as much rainfall. And then we have the rainfall again and the salinity drops again. All right. So any microorganism that lives in an environment where there is fluctuating osmotic potential needs to deal with that. And frequently they'll deal with that using what's known as osmotic adjustment. And this is something we talked about with temperature as well. It's a climatization response that involves changing the solute concentration in their body in order to sort of stabilize themselves relative to the osmotic potential in the environment around them. There's two ways they can do this. So basically they want to maybe become, if the environment becomes more salty, then they may want to become more salty. And so they could synthesize salts, and that's one way to make their sort of internal guts more salty so that it's more similar to the environment around them if the environment becomes more salty. The other thing they can do is they can actually take some inorganic solutes from the environment and put that in their body to again sort of balance it out. Now, not surprisingly, not all microorganisms can do this. And so not all microorganisms can live in regions where there is varying salinity, or even in regions where there's high salinity if they're not made that way. But there are a number of bacteria that do this very, very well. One example is Halobacterium, which can even adjust to salinity, the high salinity and the fluctuating salinity in saline lakes. So again, it's sort of very good at regulating its osmotic potential relative to its environment in order to make sure it doesn't become too hyperosmotic and shrink up to nothing, or too hypoosmotic and explode. All right. So the next thing to think about is microorganisms that are terrestrial. So microorganisms can live on land. They can even live in very, very, very dry environments. And in these environments, they do face water limitation. And so one way that they frequently deal with that is to form spores. A lot of bacteria will sporulate anytime the system dries out. And this is basically a way to avoid the water limitation. Remember, we talked last class about two ways of dealing with the stress. One is to tolerate it, one is to avoid it. So a number of bacteria just avoid it by forming spores. Other fungi and yeasts and other microorganisms do grow in very dry environments, and they basically tolerate it. And so that there are bacteria that grow in very dry environments. However, most terrestrial microorganisms are found in soils with high water content, and so frequently they're sort of much more prevalent in areas where water limitation is not a stressor. They don't do as well where it is. All right. Now, both microorganisms and plants use water balance in order to sort of form their shapes. And so both microorganisms and plants have cell walls. In bacteria, these are made of peptidoglycans and lipopolysaccharides. In fungi, it's typically chitin, and in plants, it's cellulose. But with all of these, they have this cell wall, and then they use that water and that water balance to generate turgor pressure. And that makes the organism sort of expand. In a plant, that makes them sort of stand up tall and be able to hold their shape and photosynthesize. When you don't water them, they kind of wilt. and that's that loss of turgor pressure. And so that happens in both microorganisms and plants. When they have sufficient water, that actually is important in sort of just their whole shape and their whole structure. So again, being able to maintain water balance is very important in terms of just being able to function properly. All right. So we talked a little bit about how microorganisms manage water balance. We talked about how that's important for microorganisms and plants. Now let's think about how plants maintain water balance. So not surprisingly, plants take up water from sources of higher water potential. So we find plants in a lot of different environments. In freshwater plants, again, freshwater organisms tend to have issues with too much water almost. And so what happens is that the solutes that are in the cells of freshwater plants actually allow water to flow in, and it does so quite readily because the freshwater tends to be hypoosmotic relative to the plant. And so the water just flows into the plant, and it's pretty easy for freshwater plants to access sufficient water. In fact, frequently they're facing the opposite scenario where they got too much. A little different with marine plants. With marine plants, the water is salty, so it's not necessarily just flowing into the cell. And so marine plants often have to adjust their osmotic potential by synthesizing solutes or taking up inorganic solutes, very much like the microorganisms, how they deal with that saltier environment. Terrestrial plants face that loss of water to the dry atmosphere, and so they tend to acquire it from the nearest good water source, which is most generally soil, and they do so through their roots and also through mutualistic fungi called mycorrhizae. All right, so that's how plants take in water, whether they're freshwater plants, marine plants, or terrestrial plants. They lose water primarily through transpiration through the stomates. And we talked about that a little bit in last class, where they can actually open those stomates wide, and that actually helps with evapotranspiration and cooling of the plants. The other reason why opening those stomates is important is that it allows them to take up CO2. And so they take up CO2 and then they spit out water and oxygen. And again, transpiration, that spitting out of water is also necessary for cooling. And so there's a trade-off with that opening of the stomates in terms of being able to cool themselves, being able to take in carbon dioxide, but then not losing too much water to the environment that they dry out. They lose that turgor pressure, they wilt, and they're no longer able to photosynthesize, and everything bad happens. All right. So the reason that you can actually get transpiration through the leaves is because leaf transpiration actually creates a water potential gradient. And so we have a decreasing water potential from the soil to the roots to the stem to the leaves. We have high energy water down at the soil, and we have low energy water transpiring out the leaves. And so water tends to flow from the soil to the leaves. And there's actually quite a high resistance of movement of water through the soil, through the roots, to the stem. And then once it hits the leaves, though, we have actually a low resistance to the movement of water out of the stomates. And so within the leaves, we kind of like really good at losing it, but it's hard to get it in. And so as a result, you often have less soil water input into the leaf than the leaf is actually outputting. And so there's a net loss. You're losing, because it's so easy to lose it with transpiration, but there's kind of this resistance all the way along through the plant into the leaf. You actually, at least when transpiration is occurring, you tend to have a net loss of water. So how does the plant manage with this net loss of water? Well, the fact is that primarily the plant allows for transpiration during the day. So the plant opens its stomates, and it does that because, first of all, it's hot, so it might want to cool itself in the middle of the day. Second of all, it needs to do photosynthesis in the middle of the day, so it needs to take in carbon dioxide. So it needs those stomates open. But unfortunately, like I said, what happens then is we're losing a lot to transpiration, and we got this resistance to pulling it up, so we have a net loss of water. And that would be bad if that happened, consistently through time. But at night, what happens is the plant closes the stomates. First of all, it doesn't need to cool itself as much with evapotranspiration. Second of all, it's not photosynthesizing at night because there's no sunlight. So there's no reason to have those stomates open. And so it closes the stomates. We don't have that evapotranspiration. And so we actually have the water content rise again because it's coming in from the soil through the stems up to the leaves, but then it's not being lost by transpiration at the leaves. And so you can actually see this in terms of the days. You actually see the water in the soil, and then the water in the roots, and then the water in the leaves, and you can see that as you go through the middle of the day, that water potential in the leaf actually drops. It drops every single day because the stomates are open. Now, this is a particular graph where we're actually showing a period of 5 days where we haven't had a lot of precipitation. So the soil is actually drying out. That red line in the bottom graph gets lower and lower and lower because I'm getting less and less water in the soil. And what you'll notice is that eventually you stop having those dips. The dips kind of start decreasing in the leaf, and that's because the leaf says, hey, I'm running out of water. I'm not even going to open my stomates in the middle of the day, right? And so plants that are happy will open their stomates in the middle of the day. They cool themselves, they photosynthesize, then they close the stomates at night. Plants that are running out of water because of a drought, for instance, they keep those stomates closed even during the middle of the day. And so they don't lose the water in the leaf as much, but they also don't do transpiration. And so that can be a problem. It's a problem because it impairs photosynthesis. Because they're running out of water, the turgor pressure is lost that holds the plant in shape. And so that further compounds the problem with photosynthesis because they're not holding their leaves out to catch the sun. And then they actually end up with a loss of xylem function even because the xylem is no longer held sort of in a nice rigid position. And so this is ultimately lethal for the plant because it's almost a positive feedback system where, it can't photosynthesize, it wilts, then it really can't photosynthesize, and then everything kind of collapses. And so it's really important that plants get sufficient water because if they don't, you end up in this cycle where the plant eventually just can't function. And that's why I should water my peace lily that's sitting outside looking completely dried out. All right. So even, in the best of scenarios, even with all these different techniques that the plants have to deal with water balance, they can face periods of drought. And in fact, in certain environments, droughts are pretty common. In others, they're not common, but in some environments, droughts happen every year or a couple of times a year. And so plants that live in those environments need to have ways to adapt to the drought. And there's a couple of different things that plants can do to better deal with drought conditions where they have trouble getting enough water in to sort of make up for what they're losing through transpiration. One, they can do seasonal shedding of leaves. And so plants that have sort of periodic, seasonal, predictable droughts will often just drop their leaves during the drought period. And that way they don't photosynthesize, but they're also not losing any water out through the leaves, through the stomates, because they have no leaves. There can also be abscisic acid signaling that tells the guard cells to close when they're under periods of drought, and that sort of again lowers transpiration. Plants can also have very thick waxy coating that helps to prevent loss of water, not through the stomates, through just the cells in general. And then the final thing that plants can do, they can have higher ratio of below ground to above ground biomass. And you actually see that in the figures below. Basically, if you have more roots, you have sort of more area to suck up water from, and that allows you to really do a good job of getting every drip of water that you can. And so if you have that much higher amount of roots, you can compensate for the loss in the leaves because you're just pulling it in from a wider area and you're losing it out of a smaller area. All right. It's a little less common than having too little water, but plants can also have too much water. And waterlogged soils can be a problem because, first of all, they can inhibit oxygen diffusion, lead to hypoxia. I think we talked about hypoxia a few lessons back in the context of aquatic systems. Basically, the plants need to get oxygen, and if they can't, then they die. Too much water can also cause growth of harmful fungi because fungi do tend to do really well in sort of water environments. We talked about how a lot of microorganisms do best in very wet environments, and they're not as common in dry environments. Well, sometimes those microorganisms hurt the plants. So there's a couple things that plants can do to deal with too much water. Again, it is a little bit rarer. Particularly, it's harder to deal with the harmful pathogens, but they can deal with the harmful or the low oxygen levels. One thing, they can develop parenchyma, which is root tissue with air channels, and that sort of allows the air to get into the roots. They can also develop pneumatophores, which are roots that extend vertically above the water or above the waterlogged soil. And so you can see right here, these are pneumatophores, and they actually the soil is too damp to get enough oxygen into the roots, but the roots kind of come up above that damp waterlogged soil and they get the oxygen directly from the air. All right. Water balance isn't just a problem for microorganisms and plants. Water balance is, of course, a problem for animals as well. And actually, water exchanges in animals are very diverse. Animals have sometimes specialized organisms or areas where there's specialized for water and solute exchange. This can be in areas where they have gas exchange. It can also be in areas where they have ingestion or digestion, excretion or circulation. All of these different systems can act as locations where you deal with your water and solute balance. Not only do organisms have specialized organs, but also they can have behaviors that allow them to moderate their water balance. So they can seek out areas that are conducive to water or solute balance. If you're up desiccating on the stands in Death Valley, you might wander down to the concession stands and buy yourself a drink. That's a behavior that is dealing with the loss of water, right? Animals do the same thing. They might seek out shade to prevent, evapotranspiration. They might seek out a lake to sort of immerse themselves in or to drink from. All of these things, these are behaviors that modify water balance. All right. Again, just like soils, just like everything else, water balance is determined by gains and losses of water and solute. And so different animals have sort of different gains and losses. If I think about aquatic animals, they tend to lose stuff across their gills and across their skin. They also lose both solute and water in egg production and in defecating and excreting. They're pooping out stuff, and that stuff has water and it has solutes in it. They gain water and solutes through food and drink. Sometimes they uptake water or solutes through their gills or directly across their skin. And finally, oxidative metabolism can throw out the balance because, of course, when they metabolize, they make carbon dioxide and water, and that water can affect the water balance. Terrestrial organisms, they tend to lose water through respiratory evaporation. So when I breathe out, water comes out, and that's one way I lose water. They also lose it through their skin. For instance, I might sweat. Even if I don't sweat, I'm constantly losing a little bit of water through my skin. Egg or gamete production, excretion. When you poop or pee, there's water and solutes going out. And then the gains, again, like aquatic organisms, food or liquid water uptake, just directly drinking it in. There can be net water vapor absorption, and of course oxidative metabolism, because that again contributes to water. All right. So what do animals do to balance water? So a lot of marine invertebrates tend to be isoosmotic with seawater. Some of them, though, are actually capable of osmotic adjustment. Just like the microorganisms, they can sort of alter the salt concentrations in their body by exchanging solutes with the environment. So a really interesting example is this jellyfish, Aquaria victoria. And if you take it and you put them in so that they are more salty than the environment, then in a little bit, they'll initially sink to the bottom, and then after a while they'll start floating in the middle because they've actually changed their solute concentration. They have they've sort of adjusted to that by altering the amount of solute in their body to make their bodies match their environment. If you put them in and they are isoosmotic with the water or with the environment, then they'll just always float. If you put them in and they are less salty than the environment, so they are hypoosmotic relative to the environment is hyperosmotic relative to them, then they will actually float initially, but then they will regulate their salt concentrations. They will spit out some of the water, take in salts, and they will actually again start to float through the water because again they've undergone osmotic adjustment in order to become isoosmotic to their environment. All right, most higher organisms do not do that as much. Some of them can, but most of them don't. With marine cartilaginous fish, these are things like sharks and rays. Now these evolved in the ocean, so not surprisingly, they are like the ocean in which they evolved. They can thrive when they go to seawater. They have salt with their food, but they have absorb water through their gills, and so the net balance is pretty much the same. They will excrete some of the salts that they ingested in their urine, but by and large, they don't have as big a problem to deal with because their bodies in general are about 35% salinity, which is exactly the same as seawater. You might think all fish in the ocean are like that, but they're actually not. So some fish that live in the ocean, unlike sharks and cartilaginous fish, actually evolved in freshwater. And these are the marine teleost fish, or the bony fish. And because they evolved in freshwater, their bodies tend to be less salty than the salt water around them. Their bodies are more similar to fresh water. And so they have a problem because they have sort of a more water than and less salt than the ocean around them, and so they constantly lose water and gain salt to their environment. And so they lose water across their gills and in their urine, and then they have to replace that water by drinking in seawater. But the problem is the seawater they drink in is more salty than their bodies. So that's a problem because the only way they can get water is by drinking in seawater, but it's too salty. And so what they have to do is they have to excrete all that excess salt both across their gills and also in their urine. So again, because they evolved in the fresh water, their bodies tend to be more watery and less salty, less salinity than the water around them. And so in order to maintain balance, when they take in the salt water, they have to get rid of all that extra salt to keep their body at that sort of more freshwater concentration. Opposite scenario with the freshwater animals. So freshwater fish, which includes freshwater teleost fish, they tend to be hyperosmotic to the water that they live in. So if we go back to these marine teleost fish, they are hypoosmotic. They have less water than the environment around them. And again, if they're hypoosmotic relative to the seawater is hyperosmotic relative to them. With the freshwater animals, they are hyperosmotic to their environment, to the fresh water, or the fresh water is hypoosmotic relative to them. And so they're hyperosmotic because freshwater just has too little salt to, like any organism needs to have a little bit more salt than freshwater. It's just not salty enough for life to sort of function. And so freshwater teleost fish, even though they evolved in the water, they do tend to be slightly saltier than the water around them, even though they evolved in freshwater. Because they are slightly saltier, they tend to take on too much water and lose salt, right? So the water flows from the sort of higher, the lower salinity to the higher salinity. That means it flows into their bodies. And so they gain water across their gills, and they actually excrete that excess water in their urine. And so again, freshwater teleost fish will replace lost solutes with salt from their food, but then they will actually they need to keep on that salt because they're constantly facing this risk of loss of salt. And when they pee it out, they're trying to get rid of the water, but they try and hold in the salt. And so they actually expend energy to keep those solutes that they eat in their food in their body. Opposite scenario from the teleost fish, they're busy trying to dump salt as fast as they can. The marine ones, the freshwater teleost fish, are actually trying to hold on to that salt as best they can. And that's because they tend to be saltier than their environment. All right, so that's aquatic organisms, aquatic animals. Terrestrial animals, of course, have that problem where they have to exchange gases with a dry environment. And because it's a dry environment, they're constantly losing water to the environment. And so a lot of animals have tried to minimize water loss by either living in moist areas, hanging out in the ponds, even though they are terrestrial. Things like salamanders do that. Or by increasing their skin resistance to water loss. So they try and make this barrier that prevents water loss through their skin. And so a good example is the desert iguana. That guy has skin with an extremely high resistance to water loss because it's in such a water poor environment where water is such an important resource. And so that's sort of what the desert iguana has done, is develop this very thick protective coat that holds the water in. Unfortunately, when you develop this coat that holds the water in, it can actually limit gas exchange. And so, your salamanders, they can undergo gas exchange through their skin, and that enables them to sort of breathe more effectively. That's not possible with a desert iguana. All right. So reptiles, snakes, lizards, tortoises, like the desert iguana here, they tend to be very successful in dry environments, and that is because they have that thick skin that forms a barrier to water loss. Amphibians tend to have taken the opposite strategy. These are frogs, toads, and salamanders. They actually maintain that gas exchange through the skin, and they have a very thin skin, and so they're very low resistance to water loss. They're at the other extreme. And as a result, these guys don't tend to get that far from water. Even though some of them are terrestrial, some of them are completely aquatic, never leave the water. Some of them are terrestrial, but they're never that far from water. They're always in very moist environments. Mammals and birds are somewhat in between. They're similar to reptiles, but they have hair and feather instead of scales. But they do have sweat glands that represent this trade-off between keeping the water in, being resistant to the water, but also losing that water through evaporative cooling. So again, they're maybe not as good as the desert iguana, but they're better than the salamanders. Arthropods have some of the highest resistances to water among all terrestrial animals, and that's mainly because they have that hard, thick chitin exoskeleton that frequently is coated with waxy hydrocarbons. And if you think about a wax layer, water just kind of beads up on it. It can't get through it, and that's exactly what they're doing. Some of them even have specialized behaviors. This is a desert beetle that actually collects dew, and you can see a dewdrop coming down, and it collects the dew in the morning, and it actually drinks that. So some of them have specialized behaviors as well. And arthropods can live in some of the driest areas on Earth. So different organisms have different tolerance for losing water. Things like mollusks can actually lose 35 to 80% of their weight in water and still survive. Humans cannot. We can lose about 10 to 12% of our water, and then we're kind of kaputs. And so that's why when you're hiking in areas that are very dry and very hot, you got to be careful about staying hydrated. Every year people end up trying to hike in the Grand Canyon in the middle of August, and they essentially just dry out. And so, if they were a different organism, they might tolerate something like a camel. They might tolerate 30% loss in weight due to water loss, but they're not, and so they die. So that's tolerance for water loss. There's also differences among species in terms of their resistance to water loss, how much they prevent water from being sort of lost to the environment. Not surprisingly, some of the organisms with the absolute highest resistances to water loss are your desert organisms. The best are your desert arthropods, like your spiders and scorpions. Your reptiles are sort of second best, some of your lizards and tortoises. And then we move to the organisms that are kind of poor at preventing water loss. And not surprisingly, a lot of these are marine organisms, things like fish or aquatic organisms. So fish and frogs that live in very, watery areas where water loss is not a huge problem. And then earthworms are sort of another one where they're in the soil that's, again, often very, very moist. You would not find a lot of earthworms in very dry desert soils because they're not good at preventing loss of water. All right. So different organisms tolerate different amounts of water loss. Different organisms have different resistances to water loss. And that's not super surprising because most of the Earth is pretty dry. So arid conditions are common over more than 60% of land surface. And so most organisms do face dry conditions, and a lot of them just try to avoid it. They might sporulate, they might leave, they might not live there in the first place. There are, however, some organisms that can tolerate massive losses of body water, 80 to 90% body water. So if I go back, the mollusks only get up to 80%. Some organisms can actually lose 90% of their mass in body water. How do they do this? Well, they do this by forming or synthesizing sugars that form glassy coatings over their cell constituents. And that kind of protects the cells even when they get desiccated. One example here is this club moss, where you see the desiccated dry form, and if you water it 6 hours later, it looks like a fully formed plant. It's basically one of those organisms that can lose almost all of its body water and still be okay. And again, it does that by making specialized sugars. Just a little plug for my husband's research. He actually uses some of these sugars to try to preserve and dry out cell contents that he can use for sort of portable biochemical reactions. And so he's actually using these specialized sugars, trehalose is one of them, that form these glassy protective layers around, in his case, not cells, but just the proteins and enzymes in the cells, the cell guts. And then that actually allows these cells to be dried out completely into powder form and then be rehydrated in the field to do whatever function he wants them to do. Desiccation tolerance, although it does occur, it occurs in sort of some of those club mosses, it's actually pretty rare. And it's rare for a number of reasons. It's rare because the organism must have a lot of sort of different skills to be able to desiccate effectively. First, it has to shrink as it dehydrates. Second, the water loss has to be slow enough to allow sugars to synthesize. So, if you lose water in the span of an hour, you're not going to be able to make all those sugars that form the glassy protective coat. You need to be able to at least slow the water down enough that you have time to build up the protective sugars. On the other hand, the water loss has to be fast enough to avoid too much metabolism at low water content. So if you try to undergo metabolism without enough water, you can really run into problems. So there's this trade-off where you're slow enough to make sure you make the sugars to protect you, but fast enough to make sure that you're not sort of trying to run the cell at very, very low water concentrations. And in general, only very small organisms seem to be able to fulfill these requirements. Most of the organisms that can kind of dry out to extreme levels tend to be very, very small. And one of the best are water bears, moss piglets. They have a number of different names. But these little organisms can sort of dry out to almost no water at all. And for that reason, they have been sort of sent all over. They've been sent on spaceships, and they rehydrate and sort of come back to life. So they're really amazing creatures, and one of the best examples of desiccation tolerance in the animal kingdom. All right, so that's our talk about moisture and tolerating the physical environment in terms of making sure you have enough moisture, making sure you have enough water, and maintaining water balance. So if you have any questions, I encourage you to shoot me an email and we can talk about it. All right,